There was a scream in Talbot County, Maryland, the kind that never travels past the tobacco fields. The stars heard it, the creek heard it, but no living soul on the Ridley farm dared answer. It was August 1829. A pregnant black woman named Sarah was running barefoot through the dark, blood on her legs, one hand pressed against her side, the other wrapped over the child inside her. She was not running away from the plantation. That was the cruelest part. She was running on it, trapped inside its borders like an animal in a fenced fire. Behind her, the dogs were getting closer, and the man who ordered them loose was the man who owned her, Jacob Ridley. No one on that farm said out loud what Sarah had done to deserve it. They did not need to. Everyone already knew. She had refused him, refused what he believed was his right to take, and in a world where the law called her property, that refusal became a crime. They found her by the creek just before dawn, still alive, barely, labor already tearing through her body, mud on her face, reeds tangled in her hair, the dogs circling, the men breathing hard in the morning dark. Her son was born there, in the mud, in the reeds, in terror. Jacob Ridley watched from horseback, as if none of it belonged to him, arms crossed, face blank, the expression of a man observing weather. Sarah lived 3 more days, just long enough to hold the child, just long enough to name him, Thomas, and just long enough to whisper something into his ear that nobody else heard. Then she was gone. 18 years later, that boy came back to the same farm, not as a slave, not as a frightened child, but as the reckoning his mother had seen before she died. Talbot County sat low and flat against the eastern edge of Maryland, where the land opened toward the Chesapeake and the fields stretched out in long patient rows of tobacco and corn. It was rich country. That was what white men called it. Rich soil, rich harvest, rich families. What they meant was this: the land made certain men wealthy because black hands were forced to make it so. Jacob Ridley was one of those men. He owned 200 acres, a white house with columns, a kitchen house, a barn, a smokehouse, and 43 human beings. His father had owned people, his grandfather before him. To Jacob, that made ownership feel less like cruelty and more like inheritance. Something old, something stable, something he mistook for order. Sarah had been bought in Baltimore at 16, young, strong, quiet in the way people become quiet when the world is already listening for weakness. Jacob noticed her immediately. Not because she spoke, she rarely did. Not because she sought attention, she never did. He noticed her because some men confuse beauty with invitation, and once that confusion hardens inside them, they begin to call it entitlement. Sarah loved a man named Elijah, a field hand who had grown up on the Ridley land, tall, broad-shouldered, careful with his words, careful with hope. They found each other the way enslaved people found everything worth having, quietly, in fragments, in glances stolen between work, in promises made where no white eye could see them. When Jacob Ridley came to Sarah's cabin in the spring of 1828, she did not plead. She did not flatter him. She did not perform the surrender he wanted. She simply held herself in a way that said no, not with her mouth, with her stillness, with the refusal in her eyes. Jacob could have forced her. Men like him did that every day. The law would have protected him. The county would have looked away. But Jacob Ridley liked to think of himself as something finer than brutal. A gentleman, a man of discipline, a man obeyed without needing to lower himself into obvious savagery. So he chose a punishment that felt cleaner to him. He sold Elijah south. Georgia,
Cotton country, the place men were sent when someone wanted them used up fast. Then he moved Sarah to the farthest fields, cut her food, increased her labor, and made certain she understood the lesson.
Defiance would cost her everything. It should have broken her. That was what he expected. But men like Jacob Ridley misunderstood women like Sarah in the same way they misunderstood everyone they owned. They thought pain ended resistance. Sometimes, pain clarifies it. When Sarah became pregnant with Elijah's child, Jacob's anger changed shape. It became colder, quieter, more deliberate. By the time August came, he had already decided what would happen next. Sarah would be sold. The child, too, sent south after the birth, erased from the land as neatly as Elijah had been. But someone in the kitchen heard the plan. A girl named Penny, young enough to still be frightened by every whisper, old enough to know what being sold south meant. She ran the news to Sarah before sundown, and that night, everything broke. Sarah did not run because she believed she could escape. Not truly. Not 9 months pregnant. Not in slave country. Not with patrol roads, dogs, and hundreds of miles between her and any free state. She ran because there are moments when the body chooses motion over despair. Moments when standing still would be a worse kind of death. So she ran into the dark, and Jacob Ridley sent the dogs after her. The overseer went first, a man named Calhoun, mean in the lazy way of men who enjoy humiliation more than labor. 2 others followed with torches. The light moved across the fields like fire searching for something to punish. Jacob stayed on the porch at first, watching, waiting, certain the night would return her to him. And that was the thing about men like Jacob Ridley. They mistook power for permanence. They believed that once they had decided an ending, the world was obligated to obey it. By dawn, Sarah would be back on his land, bleeding, broken, and carrying the child he already planned to sell. But before that child ever learned to speak, before he learned his letters, before he learned his mother's name from other people's mouths, his life had already been given a direction. Not by Jacob Ridley, not by the law, not by the plantation, by the woman running barefoot through the tobacco fields, refusing to surrender the last thing that was still hers. And when they finally found her by the creek, the reckoning had already begun.
Sarah was carried back from the creek just after sunrise. 2 women lifted her onto a rough wooden cart. Her body was shaking, her skin pale beneath the streaks of mud and blood.
The baby cried weakly beside her, a thin, fragile sound, but it was alive. And on that plantation, sometimes survival itself was a kind of defiance. Jacob Ridley rode ahead of the cart. He never looked back. To him the matter was already finished. A problem resolved. Another piece of property returned to its proper place. Sarah was taken to one of the slave cabins near the back of the property, a small wooden structure with a dirt floor and a narrow bed. The women laid her down gently, but even they could see something was terribly wrong. The bleeding would not stop, no matter how tightly they wrapped the cloth, no matter how carefully they cleaned her wounds. Something inside her had torn, something that would not heal. Old Esther stayed beside her. Esther had been on the Ridley farm longer than anyone else, 40 years, long enough to see children born, and long enough to bury most of them. She held the newborn boy close to the fire, trying to warm him, trying to coax strength into a body that had arrived too soon and too violently. For 2 days Sarah drifted in and out of consciousness. Sometimes she whispered Elijah's name. Sometimes she stared at the ceiling as if she could see through it. past the roof, past the sky. On the third day, she woke fully for the first time. Her voice was thin, barely more than air moving through her throat. "Let me see him." Esther hesitated. The child was so small, so fragile, but she placed him carefully into Sarah's arms. Sarah held him against her chest, her fingers trembling, her eyes studying his face as if she were trying to memorize every detail before the world could take it away. "My son," she whispered. The other women turned away. Some cried quietly, some prayed, because they knew what was coming. Sarah kissed the child's forehead, then she leaned closer, her lips almost touching his ear, and she whispered something so soft that only Esther heard it. "He will be free." Esther blinked. "What you mean, child?" Sarah smiled faintly, the kind of smile that belongs more to memory than to the present. "I saw it." "Saw what?" "In a dream." "He grows tall," Sarah whispered, "stronger than any man on this land. He walks away from this place on his own feet, and no one can stop him." Her breathing slowed, each breath shallower than the last. "And one day," she said, "he comes back." Esther leaned closer. "For what?" Sarah's eyes drifted toward the door of the cabin, toward the distant white house on the hill. "For the truth." An hour later, Sarah was gone. They buried her behind the cabins that evening. No stone, no marker, just a patch of earth and a memory carried by the women who had known her. The boy survived. No one expected him to, but he did. They named him Thomas, just as Sarah had asked. He grew up the way children did on plantations. Quickly, hard, without softness. By the time he was 6, he was already hauling buckets of water. By 8, he was walking the tobacco rows with the older boys, picking worms from the leaves in the burning summer heat. By 10, his hands were already scarred from work meant for grown men. Jacob Ridley never acknowledged him as anything more than another laborer, another body that would eventually repay its cost in work. To Ridley, Thomas was simply the leftover consequence of a woman who had once been inconvenient. But the women of the quarters remembered. They watched the boy carefully, protected him where they could, fed him when rations ran thin. Old Esther kept the deepest secret. She never told Thomas the full truth about his mother. Not yet. Some stories are too heavy for a child's bones. So Thomas grew up with fragments, small pieces of a life he could not remember. A name, Sarah, a promise, freedom. But children notice things adults try to hide. Thomas watched the manor house on the hill, watched Jacob Ridley ride past the fields, watched the overseer Calhoun with his whip and his cruel laughter. And even before he understood why, he felt something cold settle inside him whenever he saw them. The Ridley plantation was not the worst place a slave could live, but it was far from kind. Food was thin. Winter was bitter. Summer work never seemed to end. Sickness swept through every few years and carried people away like wind through dry grass. Jacob Ridley believed himself a fair man. He did not beat people for sport. He did not waste labor with unnecessary cruelty. But he also never cared when suffering happened. To him, people were tools, and tools existed to be used until they broke. Thomas grew taller each year, stronger, quieter, more watchful. He learned the rhythms of the farm. When the overseer drank too much, when Jacob left for town, which fields were hidden from the main road, which paths led through the woods. Most of all, he learned how to remember. At night the older men told stories in low voices, stories about escapes, About the North. About places where black men could walk without chains. Most of those stories ended badly. Captured runaways. Broken bodies. Families torn apart. But every once in a while, one story ended differently. Someone made it. Someone disappeared into the dark and was never seen again. Those stories stayed with Thomas, like sparks in dry grass. When he was 10 years old, something else happened. Something that quietly changed the direction of his life. A traveling preacher began visiting Talbot County. A thin white man with careful eyes and a Bible that looked older than he was. His name was Reverend Cole. He held small gatherings in the woods outside the plantation, reading scripture, praying, speaking softly about mercy and justice. Most of the enslaved workers attended only for the prayers. Religion was one of the few comforts they were allowed. But Thomas listened for something else. One evening after the others left, the preacher stopped him. "You can read." Thomas shook his head. "No, sir." The preacher studied him for a moment. Then he drew a few letters in the dirt with a stick. "This is A," he said. Thomas watched carefully, memorizing the shape, memorizing the sound. Within a year, he could read simple words. Numbers 2. Knowledge became his secret weapon. A quiet rebellion no overseer noticed. Reverend Cole never spoke openly against slavery. That would have been too dangerous. But sometimes, when he read certain passages from the Bible, his voice changed. About chains being broken. About captives being freed. About justice coming slowly, but surely. After one lesson he placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder. "You're a sharp boy," he said quietly. "Don't let this place make you forget that you're human." Thomas nodded. But deep inside, something else was growing. Something stronger than hope. A debt. And when Thomas turned 12, old Esther finally decided he was old enough to understand it.
Esther waited until the sun was almost gone. That was when the plantation quieted. The overseer finished his rounds. The fields emptied, and the white house on the hill began lighting its lamps. "Come walk with me," she told Thomas. Her voice was soft, but there was something in it that made him follow without asking questions. They walked past the last row of cabins, past the edge of the tobacco field, to a narrow strip of trees where the land dipped toward a shallow creek. The sky was red with sunset, the same creek where Sarah had been found years before. Thomas didn't know that yet, but Esther did. She lowered herself slowly onto a fallen log, her old bones stiff from decades of labor, her cane resting across her knees. "You old enough now," she said quietly, "old enough to know the truth." Thomas stood still, waiting. "Your mama didn't just die." The words landed heavier than he expected. "What do you mean?" he asked. Esther lifted her eyes toward the manor house on the hill, the white paint glowing in the last light. "That man up there," she said, "Jacob Ridley. He's the reason she's gone." Thomas felt something tighten inside his chest. Not fear, something colder. Esther told him everything, slowly, carefully, about Elijah, about the night Jacob came to Sarah's cabin, about the refusal, about the punishment, about Elijah being sold south, about Sarah's pregnancy, about the dogs, the chase, the creek, about the birth in the mud, and the 3 days Sarah spent dying. When Esther finished speaking, the sun had disappeared completely. Night had settled across the fields. Thomas said nothing. He just stared toward the distant house. His hands slowly closed into fists. "She told me something before she died,"
Esther added quietly. Thomas turned toward her. What? She said if you lived. Esther paused. You would settle it. The wind moved softly through the trees. What does that mean? Thomas asked. Esther shook her head slowly. She didn't say, but she said you had her fire. Thomas stood there for a long moment, silent, thinking. Then he nodded once. I'll know. From that night forward, something inside Thomas changed. He worked the same fields, followed the same routines, spoke the same quiet words. But inside, he was building something. He studied everything. The paths through the woods, the roads leading north, the distance between farms. He watched the overseer, learned when Calhoun drank too much whiskey, learned when the man slept in the barn. He listened to older men talk about escapes, what worked, what failed, what got people killed. Every piece of knowledge became part of a plan, even if he didn't yet know the full shape of it. By the time he was 15, Thomas understood something clearly. One day he would leave that plantation, but leaving alone would not be enough. Every night he dreamed of the same thing, his mother running through the fields, dogs behind her, blood on the ground, and Jacob Ridley standing there, watching, doing nothing. Thomas woke from those dreams with his jaw tight, the same thought returning again and again. This has to be answered. Years passed, hard ones. Thomas grew tall, broad in the shoulders, strong from endless work in the fields. He learned to hide what he felt, to keep his face calm, his voice steady. Men who showed anger on plantations rarely lived long, but the anger never left him. It simply sharpened. In 1846, things began to change across Maryland. The tobacco economy was collapsing. Years of over-farming had drained the soil. Prices were falling. Farmers were drowning in debt. Some plantation owners began freeing their slaves, not out of kindness, but because enslaved labor had become expensive to maintain. Others chose a different solution. They sold people south, to the cotton plantations of Georgia and Mississippi, where labor was cheaper and lives were shorter. Rumors spread through the slave quarters at night, names whispered in the dark, families bracing themselves for separation. One evening Thomas heard something that made his stomach turn cold. His own name passed between two men who thought he couldn't hear. Jacob Ridley was making a list, selling the strongest workers first, while they still had value. Thomas understood immediately what that meant. If he stayed, he would disappear south, just like Elijah, and whatever promise his mother had whispered into his ear would vanish with him. So he made his decision. He would leave. But unlike the others who dreamed of escape, Thomas had a second plan waiting behind the first. He would come back. For months he prepared quietly. He stole small pieces of food, hid them inside a hollow tree near the property line. He studied maps Reverend Cole brought during his visits, memorizing roads, rivers, the direction of Pennsylvania. He spoke carefully with an old man named Moses, a former runaway who had been captured decades earlier. Moses told him what mistakes to avoid, which patrol routes to watch, how to move without leaving tracks. You run straight north, Moses warned. You dead. Move slow, move quiet, let the night hide you. Thomas listened to every word, stored every detail. Then one night in late September of 1847, he walked away. No running, no panic, no farewell. Just a steady walk down the narrow dirt road that led north. Behind him, the Ridley plantation slept, believing it still owned him. Ahead was 11 days of darkness, 11 days of hunger, 11 days between slavery and something else, freedom. But Thomas carried something with him that most runaways did not. He carried a promise, and promises sometimes travel farther than chains ever could. The road north was longer than Thomas had imagined. Not because of distance, but because every mile carried risk. Every shadow could hide a patrol. Every barking dog could become a death sentence. Thomas traveled at night, always at night. During the day he hid. Barns, drainage ditches, thickets thick enough to swallow a man whole. The first 3 days were the hardest. His feet blistered through thin shoes, his stomach twisted with hunger, and the fear, the constant, grinding fear, never left him. Twice he nearly died. The first time was in Delaware. He was crossing the edge of a small town just before sunrise. The street was quiet, too quiet. Then he heard horses. Slave patrol. 3 men. Rifles across their saddles. Talking loudly as they rode. Thomas slipped into an alley. Pressed his back against the wall. Held his breath so tightly, it felt like his chest might burst. The horses passed, hooves striking the dirt road like hammer blows. One of the men laughed about something. The other cursed the cold. Neither of them looked his way. Thomas waited another 5 minutes before moving. 5 minutes that felt like 5 years. The second time was worse. Much worse. He was following a creek to avoid the main road. The water masked his footsteps. A trick Moses had taught him. Then a dog started barking. Sharp, loud, close. A farmhouse stood just ahead. The dog ran toward the creek, snarling, alerting the whole valley. Thomas ran, straight into the water, cold mud swallowing his boots, branches slapping his face. Behind him he heard voices, men shouting. He ran until his lungs burned, until his legs shook, until the shouting faded into silence. Then he crawled into a patch of thorn bushes and stayed there until sunrise, bleeding, shaking, alive. On the 11th night, the lights of Philadelphia appeared in the distance. To Thomas, it looked like another world. Buildings stacked against the sky, smoke rising from chimneys, hundreds of lamps glowing in the dark. He had never seen a city before, never imagined one could exist. Freedom did not announce itself with trumpets. It arrived quietly, in the simple act of walking down a street without chains. But freedom in Philadelphia came with rules, unspoken ones. Runaways had to disappear, blend in, become someone new. The address Reverend Cole had given him led to a narrow brick house on a quiet street. Thomas knocked 3 times, just as he had been told. The door opened. A white woman in her 50s stood there. Sharp eyes, gray hair tied tightly behind her head. Abigail Turner, Thomas asked. She studied him for a moment, then stepped aside. Come in quickly. Inside the house smelled of bread and wood smoke. Warm. Safe. Abigail gave him food. Water. a place to wash the dirt and blood from his body. She asked almost nothing. People in her work knew better than to ask questions. "You can stay 2 days," she said. "No longer. After that you work. You earn your place. And you keep your head low." Thomas nodded. "Yes, ma'am." She handed him a small folded paper. Names. Addresses. Places where a man might find work without too many questions. "If anyone asks your name," she said calmly, "you say Thomas Freeman. That's your name now." The words settled over him like a new coat. Freeman. Within a week he found work at a stable owned by a free black man named Samuel Wright. Samuel was tall, quiet, and carried a long scar down one side of his face. He looked at Thomas's hands. The calluses. The scars. "You worked fields before," Samuel said. "Yes." "You know horses?" "A little." Samuel nodded once. "You start tomorrow." The work was hard, but it was honest. Thomas cleaned stalls, repaired harnesses, fed horses before sunrise. He slept in a small room above the stable with 2 other men who had stories similar to his. Runaways, freedmen, men who had slipped through the cracks of a brutal system. Philadelphia was full of them, walking carefully, living quietly, always aware that slave catchers prowled even free states. Freedom was fragile, but it was real. Months passed. Thomas saved every dollar he earned, hidden beneath loose floorboards. He bought new boots, a coat, a hat. He learned to walk like a free man, head high, eyes steady. But at night, the dreams returned. His mother running, the dogs, the creek, Jacob Ridley standing there. The same question returned every morning. What does justice look like when the law was never on your side? One winter evening, Thomas met a man named Benjamin. They sat outside a boarding house while snow drifted through the street lamps. Benjamin was older, missing 2 fingers, a scar across his throat like someone had once tried to end his life. "You from Maryland?" Benjamin said quietly, not a question. Thomas looked at him. "How you know?" Benjamin smiled slightly. "Same look I had when I came north." He took a slow pull from his pipe. "You thinking about going back?" Thomas didn't answer, but he didn't deny it either. Benjamin nodded slowly. "I went back once, for a man who owned me." Thomas leaned forward. "What happened?" Benjamin stared into the snow for a long moment. "What matters," he said quietly, "is that I stopped carrying him inside my head." Thomas thought about those words for weeks. He worked, saved money, watched the city. Then one afternoon, he read something in a newspaper posted outside a courthouse. A notice about a farm in Talbot County. Debt, foreclosure warnings, financial trouble. The name printed there made his heart stop. Jacob Ridley, the plantation owner who had once seemed untouchable, was collapsing. And in that moment, Thomas realized something. Revenge did not have to come with a knife. Sometimes it arrived slower, quieter. Sometimes the most powerful weapon in the world was patience. And Thomas Freeman had waited 18 years. Thomas did not rush. That was the first thing. Men driven by rage move fast. They make noise. They leave traces. Thomas had carried his anger for 18 years, long enough for it to change shape. What he wanted now was not blood. What he wanted was balance. In the spring of 1848, Thomas left Philadelphia, not as a runaway, not as prey. He returned to Maryland as a free man. His forged papers said his name was Thomas Freeman, born free in Delaware, laborer, traveler. The papers were good, good enough to survive inspection, good enough to walk through towns without chains. Talbot County looked smaller when he came back. The same roads, the same trees, the same fields stretching toward the Chesapeake. But Thomas was not the same boy who had left. He rented a room in Easton, a boarding house that welcomed free black workers, paid for a week in advance, kept his voice calm, his movements careful. And then he began to watch. Jacob Ridley was no longer the man he had once been. That much was obvious within days. The tobacco fields were thin, half the land already gone to the bank, the paint peeling from the manor house. Ridley himself rarely appeared in town, and when he did, people noticed the bottle in his hand. Debt had begun to choke him, the kind of slow strangling that wealth once kept away. Thomas understood immediately. He did not need to destroy Jacob Ridley. The world was already doing that. All Thomas had to do was help it along. He found work on a nearby farm. A man named Whitmore hired him quickly. Thomas knew tobacco better than most. During the day he worked, quiet, reliable, forgettable. At night, he moved. He spoke to the remaining workers on the Ridley land. Only 7 were left. Old men, 2 young boys, a woman who cooked in the kitchen house. They met near the creek on Sundays, the one place the overseer rarely checked. Thomas brought food when he could, a little tobacco, sometimes a few coins, but mostly, he brought stories. Stories about Philadelphia, about wages, about men who work for themselves, about cities where black people walk the streets without permission. He never told them to run. He didn't have to. Within a month, 3 of them were gone. Jacob Ridley could not afford slave catchers, could not afford replacements. His farm began to bleed labor, the way a wound bleeds strength. That was when Thomas began the second part of his plan. Debt. Every farm in Talbot County owed someone money. Storekeepers, blacksmiths, feed suppliers, bank agents. Ridley owed many of them, and most of those men believed they would never see their money again. Thomas visited them one by one. He introduced himself politely, a small investor, interested in buying distressed debts. At first they laughed. Then he placed real money on the table, and the laughter stopped. He bought Ridley's debts cheaply, pennies for every dollar owed. Small amounts at first, then larger ones. Money from his savings, money borrowed from Samuel Wright, money earned working Whitmore's fields. By midsummer, Thomas Freeman owned most of what Jacob Ridley owed. And then the letters began. Polite letters, legal letters, delivered by the county clerk. Requests for repayment. Requests Ridley could not answer. Ridley ignored the first ones, burned the envelopes, cursed the names he did not recognize. But when the sheriff arrived with a court summons, he could not ignore that. The law that had protected him for decades was now being used against him. The remaining workers left. All of them. The fields rotted. The fences collapsed. The barn roof fell during a summer storm. No one came to repair it. Thomas watched it all quietly, never appearing in court himself. Always through intermediaries. Always through lawyers. Ridley never saw his face. By August, The bank foreclosed on what remained of the Ridley estate. The land was auctioned. Men from neighboring counties arrived to pick it apart. Fields, barns, tools, everything. Thomas stood in the back of the crowd that day, hat low, hands folded. He watched strangers by the soil where his mother had suffered, watched the plantation dissolve piece by piece. But he bought nothing. He didn't need the land. The destruction itself was enough. A month later, Jacob Ridley was evicted. The great plantation owner moved into a one-room shack on the edge of town, a place worse than the cabins he once forced others to live in. Thomas waited a week. Let the humiliation settle in. Let Ridley understand that this was his life now. Then one cold evening, Thomas walked down the muddy road to the shack. Smoke leaked weakly from the crooked chimney. Inside, a bottle clinked against wood. Thomas knocked once. The door opened. Jacob Ridley stood there, older, thinner, his eyes dull with drink. For a moment, he didn't recognize the man in front of him. "Who are you?" Thomas looked at him calmly. "Someone you should remember." Ridley leaned closer, studying his face, and then recognition crawled across his expression. Slow, terrified. "No," he whispered. Thomas stepped inside, looked around the shack, the broken furniture, the leaking roof, the cold fireplace. "This place feels familiar," Thomas said quietly. Ridley collapsed into a chair. "What do you want?" Thomas crouched in front of him, eye level. "My mother died because of you." Ridley closed his eyes. "I was a different man then." "No," Thomas said calmly. "You just had more power." He stood slowly, looked around the miserable room. "I didn't come to kill you." Ridley looked up, confused. Death would be too easy. Thomas moved toward the door. "You're going to live," he said. "Every day. You're going to wake up in this shack and remember what you had. You're going to remember why you lost it. And you're going to die alone." Thomas stepped outside into the cold night. Behind him, Jacob Ridley sat in silence, surrounded by the ruins of the life he once controlled. Thomas left Talbot County the next morning. He never returned. He went back to Philadelphia, worked, saved, eventually moved west to Ohio. There he built something his mother had never been allowed to have: a life. A wife named Grace, children who were born free, a home built with his own hands. He never told them everything, only that he had once been enslaved, and that freedom had been worth the fight. Jacob Ridley died 4 years later, frozen in that same shack during a brutal winter. No family came, no friends, no mourners. He was buried in an unmarked grave at the edge of the cemetery. And somewhere far away, Thomas Freeman lived the rest of his life as a free man. Sarah's scream in the tobacco fields had not vanished into the night. It had simply taken 18 years for the answer to arrive. Not with violence, not with rage, but with something far more powerful. A son who remembered. A son who survived, and a son who returned, to settle the account.